to enter the second oldest church building in Charleston and the oldest Unitarian Church in the South. So we'll talk about why those things are true once we get inside. Here is the monument to William Tennant. He was the pastor at the first independent church in Charleston, the one over on Meeting Street. And he's the one who proposed building this building in 1772. We've now entered the church building. We'll talk about the architecture later when we get to the 1854 reconstruction. But construction on this began in 1774. It moved on apace, but it was interrupted by
Hurricane.
no
Fire.
American Revolution.
Wow.
So they were not able to consecrate the building, were not able to finish it, hold any services. And first, American colonial forces and later British forces were housed in the building. And both of them did a lot of damage. One of the stories, perhaps apocryphal, is that the British put their horses in the building. But at any rate, both colonial and British forces were housed in the church building. After the war, the church moved ahead with repairs to finish it up. It was finally finished in 1787. And I don't know how well you can see this, but this is what the church building looked like at that point.
The first picture.
As you can see, it's simple Georgian-style brick building. At that point, I think the best way to view this is that the first independent church in Charleston had one congregation with 2 ministers and 2 church buildings. The ministers would alternate preaching the first or the second sermon at each building. They would walk along Gateway Walk and change places. So there were 4 services each Sunday, which tells you, you can see the size of the building. That tells you how many people were involved in those congregations. That lasted for 30 years, from 1787 to 1817. A new minister had come to the first independent church in Charleston in 1815, Robert Forster. And Robert Forster was married to a Unitarian publisher, Mr. Gales, in North Carolina. Was married to his daughter. Mr. Gales was a close friend of the scientist Joseph Priestley, who was also a Unitarian. Gales was a Unitarian. Forster was concerned about the soul of his father-in-law, so he set himself the task of converting him to Congregationalism, Presbyterianism. In doing so, however, as he examined the Bible, he could find no evidence of the Trinity. So instead of converting his father-in-law, he converted himself to Unitarianism. The 3 main doctrinal differences between them is the Forster and his followers were rejecting the depravity of man, the doctrine of the depravity of man. They were rejecting predestination, and they were rejecting the Trinity. When this happened, there was a discussion in the first independent church. About half the congregation sided with Forster, about half sided with the other minister. They had an equitable decision-making process, and they decided, okay, those who agree with Anthony will go over to the Archdale Street Church along with half of the debts that we possess. Those who agree with our traditional congregational Presbyterian views will stay on Meeting Street. And so that's what happened. So in 1817, a split. We became, at that point, the second independent church in Charleston. Anthony Forrester, unfortunately, did not live long enough to fully develop the congregation. He died in 1819. A new minister was called, Samuel Gilman. You can see his picture on the wall over there. He was a young man, just graduated from Harvard Divinity School, and was an avowed Unitarian. So though the name of the church remained Second Independent Church in Charleston at this point, in 1819 we definitely became a Unitarian church, hence the oldest Unitarian church in the South. Under Gilman and his wife Caroline, the congregation flourished. The estimate by Reverend Gilman is that there were 400 members of the church. Gilman was one of the leading figures in Charleston. He was the chaplain of the Washington Light Cavalry, Light Militia, he called in other ministers. So, for example, Ralph Waldo Emerson preached here in 1826 and 1827. Wow. And in the early 1820s, this church and Reverend Gilman founded the Unitarian Book and Tract Society, which was the first organization in the United States which distributed Unitarian literature across the country. The church did so well that it managed to get rid of all those debts that they had incurred from the first independent church. In the 1830s, they were doing so well that they established satellite churches in Savannah, Augusta, and Mobile. Not only did they establish the churches, they supported them financially. Because of this prosperity, Samuel Gilman in the 1830s wrote a letter to Boston, which was the center of American Unitarianism, the center of the American Unitarian Association. And he said, there's such a difference between Northern and Southern Unitarianism that Charleston should be the center of Unitarianism in the South. That Unitarian churches in the South can understand us and we can understand them better than you can. So make us the head of Southern Unitarianism and we will take that lead. He didn't hear back. He wrote them again. He still didn't hear back. He wrote them a third time. Still nothing. After that, Reverend Gilman gave up and the church, the Unitarian Church in Charleston, joined the American Unitarian Association in 1839, And so we officially became a part of the American Unitarian Association at that point. Let me switch and talk about Caroline a little bit, because she was as well known as her husband. In fact, some people introduced Samuel Gilman as the husband of Caroline Howard Gilman.
Excellent.
She was the author of one of the Rosebud, which later became the Charleston Rose, which was one of the earliest weekly journals for young people, for children. She published that and wrote many of the articles in it. She created the Women's Working Society, which later became the Women's Sewing Guild and later became the Women's Alliance. This organization held its first bazaar in 1832. They raised $1,000 at that point, which is the equivalent of about $25,000 today. She also is the inspiration, as I mentioned, for the garden outside. She had seen the garden the cemetery in Mount Auburn, Massachusetts. And she said, that's the kind of garden we need to have here. So in the 1830s, they began creating this garden as a natural place, an English romantic garden rather than a highly pruned garden. Today, it contains, in addition to the graves, it contains many plants that are native to Charleston, many that were developed in Charleston. So it is a sanctuary for plants as well as for birds and butterflies, as we saw. The church was flourishing, and in the 1850s, the congregation, with Reverend Gilman's support, decided to build a more joyous building. They looked at the old building and said, this is somewhat somber looking. We're a joyous, a happy congregation. We want something more celebratory. But we honor this old building in which we've lived. So what to do? They hired a young architect, Francis Lee, and Lee was later joined by his old mentor, Edward Jones, and together they came up with the design of English perpendicular Gothic revival. And so they would keep the old building, they would keep the old foundation, they would keep the old walls, but they would convert it into a Gothic building, a neo-Gothic building. So they would expand the door and window here, for example, into a large stained glass. They would cover the brick with stucco. They would expand the tower tremendously, about doubling it in height. And they would add all sorts of doodads on the side. And perhaps they would add stained glass windows on the side. Perhaps most impressively, they raised the ceiling and put in the fan tracery ceiling that you see here today, and that everyone who comes into the church admires and is amazed by.
I have never seen anything like this.
It's quite impressive.
You can see a lot of it in England.
I see.
But it is very rare in the United States that you will see that.
I wondered if there was another. Do other Unitarian churches have such a...
We are, as far as I know, unique, at least unusual as a Unitarian church in our structure. The only addition to the footprint of the building was the addition of the chancel. And the chancel was added along with the painted glass window that you see there. The building had ended originally at the basic walls there, but the chancel was added. And the pulpit, the communion rail, and the painted glass window that you see there all survive from that 1854 version of the church. The painted glass that you see there is the only glass in the building, we believe, that survives from 1854. Now we're in 1854, all the celebration, Gilman preaches a sermon, he will die in 1858, so he serves for almost 40 years. Obviously, there's going to be trouble on the horizon at this point. The Civil War breaks out. The congregation is dispersed, and they close down in, I believe, 1861, not to open up again until 1865. So it's just closed up during that time. 1864, Sherman has done the March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah, and he says he's coming to Charleston next. That he's going to burn down the city where the first shot was fired in the Civil War. And he's going to dig up John C. Calhoun, and he's going to burn his bones and throw them into the Atlantic Ocean. So this church, like a lot of others, said, uh-oh, We've got to gather up all our valuables, lots of furniture, the organ, all the silver, all the church records, any photographs they might have had at that early point of photography, and they sent them away for safekeeping. Unfortunately, they sent them to Columbia.
Oh, no, that's right.
I don't know how much of your American history you remember, but Sherman never came to Charleston. Instead, he went to Columbia and burned it down. Everything was lost. After the Civil War, the church struggles. The basis for wealth in Charleston had been rice, indigo, tobacco, worked by enslaved laborers. Those enslaved laborers were no longer there. The opportunity to produce and sell these agricultural products was greatly diminished, and so Charleston struggled. It's in this time period that Caroline Gilman refers to it as the years of trial. And a newspaper reporter from New York, I believe, came down to Charleston in this time period, and he described Charleston as too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash. That's a phrase you still hear today, but it was first coined in this time period. The salvation of the church during that time was this gentleman over here, Alva Gage. Alva was from New England, but he had come down to Charleston before the Civil War. And he made a fortune. He made a fortune packing ice from New England and packing it in sawdust on ships and bringing it down to Charleston, Columbia, and beyond to sell. Even though he was from New England, he fought for the Confederacy. And after the Civil War, he was the dominant supporter, financial supporter of this church. Some years he paid the minister's salary himself. And toward the end of his life, in the 1890s, I'll jump ahead a little bit just while we're talking about Alva, he offered to build the social hall next door, Gage Hall. He built it for the church, and when he died a couple of years later, he left half of his fortune to the church. So, the main benefactor, why he's on the wall here. Let's move down closer to the chancel and to some other props here for me to talk about. In the let me take one step back. One of the reasons we are the second oldest church building in Charleston is that in the 1860s there was a major Charleston fire, which you've perhaps heard about. It destroyed what is now the Circular Congregational Church. It destroyed the Catholic Cathedral of St. John, which were both fairly close to us, but it left us relatively unscathed. So many churches got destroyed in bombings during the Civil War by this fire that we and St. Michael's are the two oldest churches. St. Michael is the oldest and we're the second oldest. In the 1880s, Charleston was hit by a number of natural disasters. In 1885, late August of 1885, there was a hurricane that blew out the stained glass windows in the side aisle. In 1886, there was an earthquake, the largest ever recorded in the South, in the East. That earthquake toppled the tower from the church, and it fell right down where you're standing. You can see here the church prior to 1886, and you can see a lithograph of what the church looked like after 1886, and you can see the destruction here.
Oh, yeah.
Now, as I said, the church was struggling financially through all of this time. So, what major destruction? Certainly no insurance to pay for it. What are you going to do with this building? As at many points in our history, we received outside help. At the very time the earthquake was happening, the American Unitarian Association was meeting in the north. And at that meeting, they raised enough money to repair the church. Thomas Silway, a Universalist minister from Boston, and an architect, came down and led the reconstruction of the building, redoing the fan tracery along the original lines, and remodeling the outside. So if you compare this picture here, the church prior to 1886, and a picture of the church today, you can see that the tower is lowered when he rebuilt it, feeling that this tower was too high. It was not stable. Taking away some of the decorations, making it a little simpler, a little less apt to be endangered by hurricanes and earthquakes. The church continued to struggle financially in the 20th century, but fortunately, no more major physical disasters to the buildings like we'd had in the 19th. But in the early 21st century, it was discovered that there were major problems with the walls because of the humidity. We did a sealing of the envelope. We did a major restoration inside. We installed air conditioning. And in the process of that restoration, it was discovered that one of the walls was about ready to fall down. All the nails underneath had rusted. It's a wonder it had not fallen on someone. But fortunately, it did not. But that was restored. The colors in the buildings were kept basically the same. But one thing we discovered is that the bulbs up there on the ceiling were gold leaf. That had been painted over, so no one knew that. But that restoration was done at this time and completed about 10 years ago, in 2010. I failed to mention, as we were talking about that restoration in late 1880s and 1890s, these windows came down from Boston at that point. Art Nouveau style. You can see how different they are from the painted glass and the chancel that dates back to 1854. Many of us love looking at the stained glass windows on the side. If we're less interested in the sermons, we can just admire the beauty of the stained glass windows because they're always there. The words on the bottom of some of the windows, I guess all the windows, are Greek and Hebrew. The Hebrew says God is one, reference to one of the dominant beliefs of Unitarianism. And the Greek says that God is spirit.
You have some of these stained glass with pictures on there. Alternate. I see on some of them.
Well, it looks like pictures. I'm not sure that it actually is a picture. I think it is just a design.
Very different.
Up and down. So I was just curious whether they have, because one of them is like geometry.
Yeah.
And the other alternate one had a picture.
Yes.
This one they tried. They just put one brown one.
That's right.
As you said, I was interested in what you taught, but I was still watching the video. So
Yes,
Beautiful.
I admire the windows, especially when the sun is shining through it. We actually, my wife and I actually had a version of the sunburst window up here made into a stained glass by a stained glass maker and have it in our house because we admire it so much.
It's beautiful.
Let me talk a little bit about Unitarianism today in our church today, and then answer any questions you have. If there's time, we can walk back out and look at the cemetery side as well at the end.
Okay.
So the Unitarian Church in Charleston is an active congregation. Right now we are holding our services under Zoom. We have over 400 members, so we're back to that number that Reverend Gilman had. I think our latest number is actually 409, but so right around that number that Gilman had in his church at its heyday.
A time of prosperity, sort of.
Yes.
Coming back.
Coming back. Unitarianism has changed. I told you a little bit about what Unitarianism was in 1819 when we became clearly a Unitarian church. It has broadened over time so that we don't look. Let me take a step back. In the 1960s, the Unitarians and the Universalists combined. Unitarians and Universalists both grew out of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th century. I know a little bit more about Unitarianism, so let me tell you that history a little bit. Michael Servetus was one of the first, credited with being the first Unitarian. He was from Spain, moved to France, argued against the doctrine of the Trinity, argued against infant baptism, argued against the depravity of man and predestination. He was captured by the Inquisition. He managed to escape from the Inquisition. But I think this is very telling about a Unitarian. He was so convinced of the power of reason that once he escaped from the Inquisition, he believed he could convert Calvin to his beliefs. So he traveled to Geneva and to ask Calvin to debate the doctrines of Unitarianism versus Calvinism. Calvin had him thrown into jail and without any debate burned at the stake.
Oh.
The Universalists developed at the same time, and their dominant belief was a feeling that God was too good to damn anyone to hell for eternity, that eventually everyone would be saved. So these two groups combined in the 1960s into the Unitarian Universalist Association. There were differences of beliefs, but the feeling was that common beliefs were greater than the differences. Today, the Unitarian Universalist Association draws on sources far beyond anything anyone would have thought about in the 19th century. So we accept as sacred doctrines the works from Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism, Judaism, Taoism, as well as literature, scientific ideas. The door is totally wide open. Whatever can provide inspiration to talk about. The second main point about Unitarianism is that we believe in deeds, not words. That what is important is action, how we live with our fellow man, with humankind. So we are an active participant, along with about 30 other churches in the Charleston area justice ministry, trying to bring justice across all kinds of different racial, income level lines in the Charleston area. That's part of our mission. We don't have any doctrine or dogma, but we do believe in working together and seeking guidance and seeking truth. We have 7 principles which guide us. Those 7 principles, again, are not dogma, doctrine, but they go from the inherent worth and dignity of every person to belief in the interconnectedness of the world in which we live and our connection to nature, that everything is connected there. And it runs all the way in between with belief in the democratic process, belief in the value of all, belief in seeking in the hope for world peace and society. So those are just principles that guide us. Our symbols, so all religious groups have symbols. I've got a pin here, which is a Unitarian pin.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And in the center of that pin is the flaming chalice, which I'll describe in a minute, which is the symbol of our church. All Unitarian churches, Unitarian Universalist churches. But around it are the symbols of other world religions. So Islam, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, they're all there. So as you look at this church, you can look here and see the foundations of Unitarian Universalist belief. You see Aaron and Moses with the Ark of the Covenant on the bottom, and above them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the evangelists. So with this window, we give voice to our Christian roots. But with the stained glass windows on the side, the Art Nouveau windows here, we give voice to an expression of looking beyond our traditions, looking beyond the past.
This is great. The arch around it so beautifully done.
And I will point out as I said, the painted glass here survives from 1854. The communion rail presides, even though Unitarianism, even back at the time the church was built, did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. They saw Jesus as a man, the Son of God, in the way that all humans are capable of becoming the son or daughter of God. But they did practice communion. We do not anymore, but we did at that point in the 19th century practice communion. Actually, I mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson earlier. He was one of the first who broke with the practice of communion with Unitarianism. I mentioned the flaming chalice. You can see it here. It was developed in World War II by the American Unitarian Service Commission, which was trying to help rescue Jews from Europe. It was a symbol of hope, the light of truth, the light of reason. It has now become the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. So most Unitarian Universalist churches, you will find some version of the flaming chalice. On their websites, you will find some version of the flaming chalice as a symbol of reason, hope, the search for truth.
Very good. So science matters.
Science matters.
I'm so glad.
Climate change is real. We have a sign. I wish we had it to show you, but it is a sign that says Black Lives Matter, science is real, love, all love is good, etc.
So you also don't discriminate. What do you use for, like Bible? You use Bible or you use your own?
We have a hymnal which has readings in it, and those readings, some of them are from the Bible, some are from the Buddha, some are from Islam, some are poetry, some are, a scientist like E.O. Wilson could be in there. And when the minister or a member of the worship committee is doing a reading, the source could be from anywhere.
What is the structure? Sorry, what is the structure of the a service. And what do you call it? Do you call it a service,
We do
a
call it
liturgy?
service, and the structure is very similar to Christian services. I came here from a Unitarian Universalist fellowship, and there the services are much less structured, much less organized, and I was somewhat taken aback when I came here that this was much more like a high church service. So it begins with the lighting of the chalice. It begins with a welcome, which comes from a member of our vestry board. There's usually an additional welcome from the minister and a reading, either by the minister or someone else. That is followed at various points some singing that takes place. We've got a choir that is great, and we bring in other singers as well, soloists. We have a story for all ages. So as we begin the service, the children are with us. And the director of religious education will read a story that is aimed particularly for the children, but is really aimed just almost as much at the adult audience as well. That is then followed usually by some more singing, by the offertory, then by the sermon, finishing up with music.
Beautiful. And I know you mentioned that during COVID, your services are on Zoom, and it's given more people an opportunity maybe to participate than being in the church itself. Excuse me, I should take my mask. Are those services open to the public via Zoom through a particular website, through your website?
Yes, they are. If they would go to the Unitarian Church website, they would find the way to access those services. Excellent. I don't know the exact
sort of passwords. Yeah.
They're also broadcast on Facebook.
Oh, excellent. So, and maybe I can connect to that as well, because I'm sure many of our viewers would be interested in seeing a service and what it's like and how it is. And I think these times are such that it gives more people an opportunity to experience that.
We have actually had members join us from our Zoom services, so that they have not actually been in this building, which is somewhat striking, because part of our appeal is coming in and seeing this gorgeous building.
Yes. For sure.
But we've had people start attending services on Zoom and actually join the church. One of the things that I failed to mention about the service is after the service, we all gather in Gage Hall. It's a social hour. So coffee, some light refreshments, and talking. During our Zoom services, we've held Zoom breakout rooms after the service. And many of us have actually found those Zoom breakout rooms better than the breakout in Gage Hall, because you can talk much more intimately with people because they're a group of 6 or so, in contrast with 150 people gathered in Gage Hall.
That's wonderful. We're learning so much about ourselves and our congregations, I think, through this time for sure.
And the light refreshment is very, very good.
You've been.
Look at that. I'm looking at food. But I have attended those.
You have.
They are very special.
Well, I know you all welcomed us and hosted our Thanksgiving service last year, our Interfaith Thanksgiving service, and it was one of the most beautiful services that I've been to. And you mentioned your choir. Your choir is one of those amazing choirs I've ever heard in terms of the singing and talent. Goodness. So if our viewers are able to watch a service, they certainly would learn. I know the choir probably isn't allowed to sing, but in little ways maybe.
They're doing some work, so they're working with some online devices that allow them to incorporate the voices. So sometimes they'll have one singer here and one over there, or with a pianist, or with somebody playing another instrument. But they have combined the voices of the choir, of many of them, so that we are able to enjoy the choir, even in Zoom.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm going to ask, I'll let you speak a little bit more if you'd like, but I'm going to ask if any of our viewers have any questions for you. I welcome them. I will be reading them and asking you what they may ask. If not, no worries at all. I think we've gotten so much information today. But
It
if,
was quite informative.
yes,
Yeah. I didn't know that it was the difference between universal and what was the other?
Unitarianism and Universalism. There's a joke. So I'll tell you the joke that I think sort of explains the difference and why they came together. That both of them agreed that there was no hell.
Oh,
Unitarians thought that mankind was too good, too inherently good to be damned to hell for eternity. And the Universalists thought that God was too good to damn anyone to hell for eternity.
I can see that. That's great.
from a different page, so.
Oh,
To imagine.
I'm just telling you
That's what the difference is.
the doctrines there.
Is the is the head of the Unitarian Church, is the association still in Boston? Is that still? I see.
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent.
Boston is the mothership of Unitarianism.
And how many churches are there in the States? Are there hundreds or in the country?
In the country,
Yes,
hundreds.
hundreds.
There are dozens in South Carolina, for example. So that there's one in Myrtle Beach, there's one in Columbia, Greenville, Beaufort, Augusta. Did I say Greenville? Spartanburg. And I'm sure there are others that I'm leaving out.
Sure.
Those are just some of them that I know.
And is there still a special connection with the Southern Unitarian churches that you described early on? Or is
We
it?
have regions, so there is the southern region, so it includes churches in the southeast. I guess extending over to the southwest.
Sure.
So how much Boston influences your activities?
Good question. I grew up as a Baptist, and one of the doctrines in the Baptist church was each church was independent and could make all of its own decisions. That's the same thing in Unitarianism. Each church is independent, but we are helped by Boston. So, for example, we are undergoing a ministerial search right now. Boston has the procedure for conducting that search laid out very well. They help us in the process. All the ministers who are looking for an assignment and all of the churches looking for a new minister work with Boston, and we submit our paperwork. The ministers who are looking see all that paperwork at the same time, and then they say which churches they're interested in. The church will tell the ministers which ones it wants to look at further and proceed with that process. So there's lots of help. There's lots of religious education material, for example, that comes from Boston.
That's great.
So
Sounds like a perfect relationship.
It's not like the Pope telling people what to believe.
Sure.
There is a pool available to you for
Yes.
a lot of things, and you can pick up whatever you want.
Yes.
That's a good one. So you keep your
That's wise. That's wise.
That's
So
right.
another thing I wanted to ask you, without baptism, how do you convert to become universal?
Good question. So I would say there are two things. One, as a child growing up in the church, you're not baptized, but there is a naming ceremony that takes place. So frequently, if a parent chooses to, it's not required, but they will come up and the church will make its commitment to help raise that child along with the parents. Then, if you are coming to Unitarian Universalism from another faith, you go through a training session that we hold, that the minister and members of the church hold to explain to you about the ideas and the commitments of Unitarian Universalism. And then you join by simply signing the book. And then we hold a ceremony here. Again, it's not one that you're required. If you have a conflict and can't come, it's not like if you don't get baptized, then it's Katie bar the door. But we hold a ceremony in which we welcome those and ask for their help in the church and make our commitment to assist them along their spiritual journey.
That sounds lovely. We've learned so much today, truly, about the history of the church in general. Very informative, and about this structure itself, this amazing structure here that has been here for so many years, 200 plus years now, right?
Yes.
And it is amazing, and I'm so grateful to you for teaching us, showing us, and opening your doors for us during COVID. Usually the Charleston Interreligious Council has in-person sacred tours, but obviously we're doing it online now, and we're really thankful that you were able to open your doors for us during this tough time and give us a sense of what your faith is like, what the structure is like, and just to meet you personally. I appreciate it. That's right, and outside, so we can walk on our way out. We can walk out and see the garden again.
And we will walk out. We're committed to providing access to everyone of whatever race, sexual orientation, background, disability. So we'll walk out the other way of entering rather than the way we entered, so that you can see a ramp that we constructed so that people in wheelchairs could access the church.
Excellent, thank you.
One of the things is, right now, the churches are so quiet.
Yes.
And we call it
I mentioned Caroline Gilman. This is a picture of Samuel and Caroline when they were young, when they were in their first years here in the church.
I think I can see it without the glare here. Excellent.
I was just telling her, right now, the church is so quiet.
Yes.
It really feels like visiting this spiritual space.
That's right.
These are bags for the children so that the younger children will have something to do as they're sitting there.
It's wise, yes.
How about the young people or the old church?
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. You can walk up.
This shows
This is
you
the way
brick,
up.
the
Oh.
brick wall. As I
yes.
mentioned, that the church maintains its old walls, and you can see them there.
Wow. Look at that.
So it's just plastered over.
Yes.
Want to take that?
Oh, yes. Our mugs, please. School next door.
I like those flowers around here.
Yes.
And it's appropriate, I think, to come close to our end, looking at this. These are in fact bricks that were made by the enslaved people who built the original church. We found them underneath the church, and they were used to construct this in honor of those enslaved workers.
Beautiful.
Look at those butterflies and the kids across.
Yes.
The church has lots of interesting people buried in it. So I mentioned the Gilmans and showed you theirs. Alva Gage is buried here. He had an interesting life in that he married sisters. So he married one sister and she died, and then he married her sister. They're buried side by side. So he's in the middle and
Each sister on the...
each side.
That is so interesting.
We also have people here buried going back to the 1780s, 1770s.
70s. Mm-hmm.
So it's a very historic. There's one person that you will, if you go to YouTube, you will probably find that that Annabelle Lee is buried here. She's not.
Oh, I see.
The story falls through in many ways. One is the family do not have a plot here that is sometimes thought could be the basis for Annabelle Lee. The second one is Poe was stationed at Sullivan's Island in the 1820s. This churchyard, which is used as the basis for Annabelle Lee and Edgar Allan Poe meeting together here, didn't exist as this kind of churchyard in the 1820s. It was constructed beginning in the 1830s. So historically, it just doesn't work.
Doesn't work. People can hope it. Well, this is beautiful. I thank you. I want to thank you again for giving us this tour, giving us your time and your knowledge and sharing it with us. What a gorgeous day. And I thank you again.
You are very welcome. It was my pleasure.
You be well. Thank you, Shayla, as well.
You're welcome. You know I love this. I really love this.
I think we all learned quite a bit. Everyone have a good day. I appreciate your joining us.